governments. But this crisis is coming during budget season, and for many local governments, there are massive budget shortfalls heading into the next fiscal year, as we've talked about on the briefing before. No businesses are open, no local sales tax revenue. So few people are occupying hotel rooms, so there's no hotel occupancy tax. The federal government has not yet determined whether they will distribute money to local governments to make up for these shortfalls. City workers are being furloughed and laid off, which will create even greater economic distress. So municipal governments are faced with decisions about where they will cut and where they will spend. And will municipal governments continue to overspend on policing at the cost to the health and safety of the entire community? Or will they invest in human needs and vote to stop the flow of money to police and jails? That's what we're going to talk about today. So I'd like to introduce Commissioner Joanne Hardesty. Commissioner Hardesty began her term in January of 2019. In her first year in office, she has worked to establish Portland's new street response, a new arm to the city's first responder system, which sends responders trained in crisis intervention and first aid rather than police officers to respond to non-emergency calls. So for individuals experiencing behavioral health crisis or people experiencing homelessness, this is what first responders do. And we actually had an episode on this a couple of weeks ago where we talked about some of the amazing work being done in Oregon. Hardesty's work on the City Commission has also led to the termination of a contract between Portland Police and ICE. And in advance of police contract negotiations that began in January of this year, 2020, Hardesty invited researchers from Campaign Zero to review Portland's contract with its police officers union and data on the police use of force, and to present their findings in a session to the City Commission. She's been fighting this fight for I've been covering stuff that Joanne Hardesty has been doing in Portland for many years. So I'm really glad you joined us, and thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Of course. So your city, Portland, currently has a $75 million budget shortfall. And you issued a statement regarding this year's budget in which you said, in the face of reductions and the uncertainty of the global pandemic, it was time to ask, what are we building towards?
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
What I meant was that COVID-19 has really pulled the Band-Aid off of the assumption that we have safety nets in our communities, that if something goes wrong, if there's an emergency, we will be able to respond to it. What we know is that the economic and public health implications, especially in communities of color, have been totally exacerbated by this pandemic. And so in my view, when I said that, what I meant was I have no interest in rebuilding an equitable system. We know that all our systems today create inequitable outcomes, especially for BIPOC communities, low-income communities, houseless community members. So I have no interest in rebuilding it. I think that there are some people with a sense that once the pandemic passed, we're going to go back to life as normal. And so I want us to rethink everything, especially how we provide first responders. I am fortunate to be in charge of Portland Fire and Rescue, the 911 call center, and the Bureau of Emergency Management. So all my employees have been on the front line of this pandemic since the beginning. And what I have seen is that what we need to do is make sure that we are taking care of the health and welfare of community members. And that, quite frankly, means that we need police less today. And we will need police, especially in the current formation, less as we get through this coronavirus. When we get to the other side and start talking rebuilding, we should be talking about what does community safety look like today, right? Because we know all these special police programs, quite frankly, have never worked. What we know is that they, in Portland, there was the Portland Police Gang Enforcement Unit that they now call the Portland Gun Violence Reduction Team. And as a secret, they changed the name when I got elected because they knew I had been following the work of this gang enforcement team for well over a decade. And 59% of their stops are of African Americans in a community with a 6% African-American population. And so for a decade, I've been going, how is that even possible? We don't have enough Black people in the city of Portland to justify 59% of their stops being of African-Americans. And so we have an opportunity now to look at every segment of policing and to do a deep analysis about whether or not this scheme still makes sense. So for me, I advocated getting rid of the school resource officers. Most students will tell you they do not feel safer having people with weapons in their school buildings. I have advocated to get rid of the transit police because using police officers to target poor people because they didn't have $2.50 to ride our public transit vehicles just seems to be a total waste of money and a wasted priority. And then third is the gun violence reduction team, which has actually received more money to actually target now gun violence. But gun violence in the city of Portland hasn't gone down at all after a year of activity with this gun violence reduction team. So clearly what we're doing with policing is not working, not for BIPOC communities, and quite frankly, not for the broader community.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about the numbers really quickly because you mentioned transit officers, you mentioned school resource officers, and you mentioned this gang unit, gun violence unit, whatever they're calling it today. So the transit officers, that's $4 million a year.
That's right.
School resource officers, that's another $4 million a year. The gun violence unit is $6 million a year. So we're talking a lot of, we're talking about a lot of money.
Yes.
In a budget that is short $75 million. That's not nothing, right? That's I'm not, as we were talking before, I'm not great at math, but that's for
real money, right?
Yeah, we're talking real money. We're talking a significant portion of what Portland needs. And so yesterday, the city commissioners voted on the budget. Can you talk about what happened regarding your suggestions for these specialty policing units?
Yes, I am thrilled to say that the outcome of our budget meeting yesterday was I have a commitment from the mayor that he and I are going to co-lead an effort to evaluate all the specialty units, not just these that I've listed, but all the specialty units within Portland Police Bureau. And we are mandated to come back to the city council in February of 2021 with a proposal that will go into the next year's budget. I am thrilled with this outcome because quite frankly, I have been pretty much single-handedly advocating for the reduction of these police units that are causing harm to BIPOC communities. And so now that the mayor is on record and we have a budget note that he and I will work together to come back with a proposal in February, I think it's the beginning of us creating both the community support to make these changes happen, and B, the political will to actually implement what comes out of the work that we do between now and February of next year. And so while I didn't get it totally pulled out of the budget, what was fabulous was so many community members coming in and echoing my perspective about these units needing to go away. And so I think within the next 6 months, we will have a good proposal about what's really core, what are core policing services that the community in Portland should expect, and what, quite frankly, the police shouldn't do. I don't believe we should be calling police for mental health issues. We should not be calling police because people are houseless and people are uncomfortable with seeing people who are houseless. So I'm gonna make the mayor better than he thought he would possibly be on this issue. And I'm thrilled that he and I will be working with community because originally the proposal was, well, the police will come back with a proposal. I know better than allowing the police to decide what the appropriate level of policing should be. And so this was a negotiated agreement between me and the mayor's office because he is in fact the police commissioner. But as you know, I use my bully pulpit to talk about police whenever I can and what real community policing should look like.
Yeah, so for more on this, I want to bring you and New York City Council member Antonio Reynoso. Let me make sure I can see you. I can.
Yes.
Hi. Just a little introduction. So Councilmember Reynoso was born and raised in the south side of Williamsburg to parents who immigrated from the Dominican Republic. He's currently serving his second term in office. Let's talk about Governor Cuomo. So at the end of April, New York Governor Cuomo announced that spending on the overall budget would shrink by at least $10 billion, with more than $8 billion of cuts in education, mass transit, children's health insurance, and substance abuse programs, $8 billion. In your city, Mayor Bill de Blasio's proposed budget slashed a popular summer youth employment program that would have offered 75,000 jobs. He's also proposed a $1.3 billion cuts in education. And he's also saying that we should keep the NYPD's nearly $6 billion budget largely intact, making minor cuts with hiring delays, as well as savings from the attrition of 100 traffic enforcement agents. So what has been your response to these cuts and the lack of cuts from the police department?
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to be here. It was a joy to hear Commissioner Hardesty go first and really see the great work that she's doing in Portland. So keep it up, and it's just great to hear that work being done. In New York, it really is something. Mayor de Blasio ran on a police reform platform, but since he's been mayor, done very little to assist in the adversity and the relationship that we have between communities and the police department. If anything, he's made it, I believe, he's added to the polarization of police and communities here in the city of New York. What we're seeing is the coronavirus is killing Black and brown families almost 3 times as fast as they are white affluent families here in the city of New York. We call for a budget that speaks to equity and pays attention to these inequities that are happening in these communities. And the mayor then decided to introduce an executive budget that pretty much gutted a lot of our social safety net programs and eliminated 75,000 jobs that go to 16 to 19-year-olds, 94% Black and brown kids, pretty much, summer youth employment program, completely gutted it, and has yet to, in some cases, increase the police budget here in the city of New York. The mayor in this city goes to his safety net. What he calls his safety valve is adding more police to things here in the city of New York. We even have these things called open streets. We're taking over streets and giving them to the people so they can ride their bikes, they can jog, they can just have more space if they're going to go outside here in the city of New York. And he said he wouldn't want to do that unless he can add more cops. And it seems like everything he wants to do is to add more cops. And we have, I believe, is 90% of the stops that have happened, or the arrests and the summonses related to COVID in the city of New York, have gone to exclusively Black and brown families here in the city of New York. So again, it just speaks to the mentality or where we're at right now when it comes to Mayor de Blasio's, where he's paying attention to things and what he's prioritizing. And it's obvious that he wants to make sure that he maintains the police department as strong as possible, and is actually adding 300 new cops to a summer program that he's introduced today. And again, the things that are being cut, homeless money is being cut. We have health and hospitals money actually being cut, not to hospitals, but to health services that we provide for trying to end the AIDS epidemic here in the city of New York, and other items that we're doing related to health are being cut. Of course, SYP, cultural institutions are being gutted. The housing department is taking a huge hit. The only agency in all of the city of New York that has been completely spared is the NYPD.
Yeah, so I want to talk about something that you just brought up. So statistics released just this last week revealed that 90% of people in New York that have been cited for alleged social distance violations or for not wearing masks are Black and Latinx people.
Yes.
We have seen videos of 5 to 7 New York police officers tackling a Black mother. with a young child in a subway station, allegedly for not wearing her mask properly.
Right.
We have seen videos of New York officers brutally arresting and beating people, for videotaping them arresting people for violating for allegedly violating social distancing rules. We have photos shown on social media revealing that groups of white people that have been congregating openly in parks or in the streets have not been cited or arrested. And
Right.
even before this, we saw just countless examples of transit officers violently arresting people for fare jumping. We have seen an over-policed New York for so long.
Yeah.
What does your community need right now in this moment of health and economic crisis? And why is what you're seeing from NYPD not the solution?
Right. Unfortunately, the NYPD in the city of New York, they have gone through training to deal with cultural sensitivity, and it doesn't seem to have worked in the city of New York. We've pretty much burned that money, seeing how they've responded to the COVID crisis. And just to be clear, an example that we're going to give is that there was a group of about 60 people in a Black community that were congregating in a barber shop. Out of the 60 people, 2 got arrested, and 58 plus the 2 that got arrested got summonses. There have been thousands of white congregants meeting in different spaces, and recently in a yeshiva, we found 60 people that met 60 to 90 people that were congregating in a yeshiva, and they were asked to go home and didn't get one summons. So in the cases when there's 2 types of people congregating, or 2, a Black community and a white community, they've been incapable of being equity in how they enforce. So at this point, we demanded that the mayor no longer use the NYPD to enforce social distancing, and it is something that he's agreed to last week. But that's only the beginning. We're going to keep trying to break that down. But what we're demanding now, again, and I believe that that's what the question is here, is just is equity in the work that we're doing. The mayor put a task force together that's supposed to look at the budget and see how it affects the whole city of New York when it comes to equity. And the committee or the task force is supposed to come to us with some study or some recommendations regarding how the budget should be molded or modified to make sure that it deals with equity. And if we don't get that study done before we pass the budget, we're going to be digging ourselves out of a bigger hole than what we started. What I'm hearing about Portland and the work that they're already doing, the New York City is way behind. And it is going to be more of the same here in the city of New York. Things are going to change, but when it comes to enforcement and what the priorities that we have in our local communities, it is going to be more over-policing in Black and brown communities, and that has not changed. The only way it would change is when term limits are up, so we'll get a new mayor, and hopefully we start seeing some change then.
Thank you so much for that. So our next 2 guests are from LA, a city of 4 million people in Los Angeles County, the most populous county in the country. Few places in California have been hit harder by coronavirus than Los Angeles, right? And we know that over half of all workers in LA are now unemployed following recent waves of job losses. And the number of unhoused people, which was already on the rise before coronavirus, is expected to increase as we know people can't pay their rents. And the pandemic has kind of exacerbated these existing inequities in Los Angeles, taking an especially heavy toll on communities of color and people experiencing homelessness. But in the face of this unprecedented health and economic crisis, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti has proposed a budget that would cut all city departments, with one big exception. Everybody want to guess? The Los Angeles Police Department. In fact, while Garcetti's proposal would cut funding for housing investment by 9.4% and jobs development by 8.9%, it would boost the LAPD budget with tens of millions of additional dollars in overtime pay. Last year, the police department received more than $3 billion, over half of LA's entire general fund. And under Garcetti's proposal, the LAPD would consume an even larger portion of that fund. And while programs to address homelessness are cut by 6%, and nearly 16,000 city workers would face furloughs to save the city money. So we're going to start with you, Nithya. So Nithya is an urban planner and the former executive director of Time's Up Entertainment. After receiving her master's in urban planning from MIT, she started Transparent Chennai in India, an organization that worked with residents of slums to create data that strengthened their advocacy for resources like running water and basic sanitation. In 2014, she worked for the city administrative officer of Los Angeles. And in her time there, she wrote a report detailing how the city was spending over $100 million in homelessness, the majority of which was spent on jailing those who don't have homes, rather than helping them into stable permanent housing and with access to services. And she went on to start a homeless advocacy organization in Los Angeles. She's currently a candidate for the Los Angeles City Council. So you've been a long time advocate for housing and for the homeless in Los Angeles. And we talked earlier about city budgeting as a zero-sum game. That is, the more spent in one department, the less money can be spent on another department. The budget has to balance out. Is that the understanding about municipal budgets, and what, when you in your experience, especially with your work on homelessness in LA, what do you think when you see these cuts by the mayor and this increase in the budget for the
Yeah, I mean, I think that's mostly a spot on assessment of city budgets, particularly I think in a state like California, where Prop 13 from 1978 really limits how much property tax can be collected and how much property taxes can make up a portion of municipal revenue. Property taxes can be more stable, while a lot of the other taxes that make up our municipal budget are really connected to economic activity and truly to economic prosperity, which we are not, we're not seeing right now. So much of our city's budget in LA comes from things like hotel taxes, from gas station franchise taxes. People aren't driving right now. Taxes related to the sale of properties. The property market is quieter now. So from sales tax. So from in every place where you see municipal budgets in California seeing their revenue come in, we're going to see really big cuts. We're going to see our local governments shrink a lot. Cities can think about raising revenue at this time, but it can be challenging. You can put together a windfall tax. You can do a bond measure. You can increase sales taxes. But again, a lot of these taxes require voter buy-in in order for them to happen. And so, yes, you are really limited. So that means that when you think about putting together a budget at this time, I think you have to ask a lot of hard questions about where you're making cuts and where you're making increases, and really about where you're seeing the greatest needs, what the city needs to be doing to address its residents' greatest needs right now. And I think that is what has been a little bit challenging about looking at this budget process. When you see that the Economic and Workforce Development Department has been cut at a time when we're going to see historic levels of unemployment locally, when you see that the Housing and Community Investment Department, which enforces tenants' rights and which manages our city's supply of affordable housing, is getting cuts at a time when people's homes are at risk. I mean, I think these are really important questions to be asking about what we're prioritizing in the city's budget, especially when it is a zero-sum game. The size of the pie is shrinking.
So you mentioned housing and community investment and economic and workforce investment. Are there other places that you identify as priorities where the city should be putting its limited resources?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think these are really important places that we should be putting actually not less resources at this time, but more resources. And I want to take a step back to think about where we should be investing at this time, because a lot of the premise of the campaign that I ran in the primary was talking about how in LA we've done a lot of poor planning, that we have spent too much money because we respond to things at the time of emergency or crisis. Mm-hmm. And homelessness is a key example of that, but it applies in a number of other places. You can use that lens to address our climate change issues. You can use that lens to address our housing issues writ large. So if you look at, for example, our city's budget today and what the budget is cutting, as I said, we're seeing some reductions to the Housing and Community Investment Department. So this department manages the city's rent stabilized properties. It builds affordable housing. It enforces tenants' rights. And this department actually wrote to the city right now during the budget process and said that they're getting 500 calls a day about people who are fearing eviction. This is during a time when there is an eviction moratorium, and they're getting that number of calls. What is going to happen as we see an end to that moratorium and as we move out of kind of the emergency period that we're in right now? And historically, this is a repeat of a story that we've seen over and over in Los Angeles. So we've actually underinvested in keeping tenants in their homes for years. So our tenants' rights system is a passive enforcement system. It depends on tenants having to exercise their rights, usually through access to a lawyer or through some kind of legal support system. So the city has never funded lawyers for people facing eviction, even though we are in a staggering homelessness crisis, and the city faces something like 30,000 evictions a year. So we've actually underinvested in keeping people out of homelessness, and then have to spend huge amounts of money in getting people housed once they've already lost their homes. And historically, as I found in my report, policing ends up being a huge part of our homelessness response system. So my report found that 90% of the city's money that was being spent on homelessness was actually being spent on putting people in jail. But that report did not even look at police officers' time. So that didn't look at what percentage of an officer's time was being spent in calls in response to, let's say there's a homeless encampment on my street and I'm calling because of that. And so actually the amount of money that we were spending on homelessness response is even bigger than what I had identified in that report. And so, I think really what we should be thinking about right now is how we can prevent having to spend in the future huge amounts in response to crisis situations, how we can keep people in their homes, how we can make sure that the impacts of this economic crisis, which are being felt so unequally across communities in the city, that we're preventing the worst from happening to people right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to move to Dr. Melina Abdullah. So Dr. Abdullah earned her PhD and master's from the University of Southern California in political science, her bachelor's from Howard University in African American Studies, and she's currently a professor and the former co-chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA, Alhambra. Love that town. She was appointed to the Los Angeles County Human Relations Commission in 2014. She's a recognized expert on race, gender, class, and social movements, and she was among the original group of organizers that convened to form Black Lives Matter LA, continues to serve as a Los Angeles chapter lead, and contributes to the national leadership. So Dr. Abdullah, you are one of, if not the kind of foremost expert on policing in Los Angeles, and you've been studying this issue for so many years. Can you talk about the particular issues with the LAPD that really make funding another $144 million to this department particularly outrageous in a moment of pandemic?
Sure. So it's really important that we understand that LAPD is the most murderous, corrupt police department in the country. Now, I know my friends in New York and Portland are going to say, no, we get that title. No, you don't get that title. LAPD regularly kills double digits of folks. So usually double the number of the people who are killed in New York are killed in LA by LAPD. And so it's important that we understand that. We need to understand that at the beginning of this year, LAPD was embroiled in all kinds of corruption scandals, from advertising for new officers in white supremacist outlets like Breitbart to there was data that came out that confirmed what communities already knew, that Black motorists are pulled over at 5 times our population share. There was data that came out that showed that Black folks who are pulled over or are stopped are searched at 3 times the rate of everybody else and 4 times the rate of white folks, even though we're less likely to have contraband on us or have committed a crime. And then finally, the most recent scandal is that LAPD's most elite, so-called elite unit, the Metro Division, had been entering Black people and brown people into its gang databases falsely. So they might pull a mom over, a pregnant mom over, and say, you know what? we're just going to put you in the database. And it takes years and money to get out of the database. And LAPD really kind of doubles down on the work that they're doing. Now, one of the reasons all of these things haven't made national headlines is LAPD is also the police department that has the largest PR unit in the country. And so what begins to happen is as soon as a scandal comes out, they do work to make sure that they erase that scandal or spin that scandal, and people don't hear about what's happening in Los Angeles. When people think about the history of LAPD, of the Rodney King beating, of the Rampart scandal, of 1965, things have not changed, they've just evolved. And so LAPD is one of the most terrible policing units in the country. And then we have a new chief, or relatively new chief of police, who is by all measures an expansionist. When he took office, he himself has 3 police shootings under his belt and 1 murder under his belt. So it's important to understand who this police chief is and why he justifies the killings of our people at the hands of police. But he's also an expansionist. One of the things that he said is that he wants police on every corner, on every church pew, and every bar stool. Now that the churches and the bars are closed, we absolutely have police on every corner. We have police in every grocery store parking lot. We have police at every food distribution center. And we have police who see it as their jobs to harass and criminalize people for being houseless, people for being poor, people for being Black.
Thank you so much. And I know Councilmember Reynoso, you might have to jump off. So please, thank you for joining us, and we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you so much. Appreciate being on. Take care.
No problem. Thank you. So can you talk just briefly, Dr. Abdullah, about what has happened with this budget in terms of timing? So it's the attempts to fast track it. And what does that mean? And how does that sort of change the process of regular civilians getting to have an input on how their municipal government is spending money?
Sure. So this budget slashes every single department other than LAPD. It proposes to spend 54% of our city's general fund on LAPD. And that's actually an undercount, because there's often contracts with other city departments with police who are, so they're giving a share of Rec and Parks funds to LAPD as well, right? And so 54% of our tax dollars going to police is outrageous. Now, normally the way the process works is the mayor proposes a budget, and I want to underscore that this mayor casts himself as a progressive. However, we can, what does it say? I don't believe what you say because I see what you do, says James Baldwin, right? So you can say you're a progressive, but when you're cutting funds to the worst housing crisis in the nation, allowing folks to live in tents during the middle of a health pandemic, then we see who you are, right? Normally his budget would go to city council then would take it to its budget committee, and there would be a pretty robust conversation around the budget, and we'd have an opportunity. And I think that many Angelenos would be engaged in this conversation, because during a pandemic, we need resources for mental health. We need resources for healthcare. We need resources for good jobs. We need resources for housing more than ever, right? So we'd be engaged in this process at both the committee level and the full city council level. What the mayor attempted to do is keep us busy with this pandemic and engage in what Naomi Klein and Angela Davis and everybody else calls disaster capitalism, keep us distracted with the disaster, and then usher through what it is he wanted. So thankfully, the people said, no, we see this, and Black Lives Matter in particular began to raise up. We need to fund services, not police. We're grateful that so many got on board, everyone from environmentalists to housing rights activists, came on board, and we got some kind of infrastructural support. And yesterday we engaged, as they were attempting to ram this budget through City Council, in a pretty robust conversation where unanimously every single public comment was against the budget as proposed by Eric Garcetti. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to block this budget, that we'll be able to at least reduce the proposed increase to LAPD and fund other city services. But we formed a coalition called People's Budget LA, and people can find out more there, peoplesbudgetla.com.
So I want to ask all three of you a question that we've kind of been grappling with here on the briefing. So during this crisis, we're seeing this incredible need for nurses and other healthcare professions. We're realizing, just like we were talking about in the green room, just how important teachers are as schools and daycare centers are closed, right? The stress on parents and families because of this has just been enormous. And in these budget cuts, whether proposed by Mayor de Blasio or Mayor Garcetti, there are these huge cuts to education and healthcare, and the same thing that you're seeing in Portland, right? There's huge cuts to education and healthcare, and yet police are protected. And policing is this male-dominated profession, and it seems like, once again, we're seeing jobs dominated by males as just inherently more valuable than teachers, childcare workers, nurses. Do you see structural sexism at play here? And any of you can answer.
I would say no question. No question. Police are seen as the authority figures, and we have allowed police to shape the public dialogue around what community safety looks like. And so I hope during this pandemic, we are starting to shift that conversation from police as the solution to what community safety looks like, to making sure that our most vulnerable people are taken care of. I have to say, I'm pretty appalled to hear about some of the other budgets around the country and how wonderful we have strong advocates that are fighting to make that happen. I want to share what we did in Portland is called the Equity Toolkit. And we put this Equity Toolkit together intentionally before we did the budget, because I want to be able to hold my colleagues accountable to their equity goals, right? Because as we all know, equity is the new buzzword, right? Used to be inclusion. I mean, every decade we come up with a new one, but we've never measured it, right? People learn the language, but we don't measure the outcomes. And I am happy to share this with you offline when the program is over, but just wanted you to know, when the brother from New York was talking, I was like, I got something for you, take this. Right? But yes, sexism is alive and well. And quite frankly, as the first African-American woman on the Portland City Council, I've had to help educate people that my voice would not be silenced. And I was there to represent the people who had never been on the City Council.
I want to let anybody else jump in really quickly on this before we get to our last question.
Well, I did just want to say that I am hopeful that that because of how valuable traditionally women's work has become in this, that we will have a reckoning in how we value it going forward. I mean, maybe that's too much to hope for, but as we were speaking before we started, every teacher should be paid $1 million a year.
Yeah, please.
I'd love to just say to Councilwoman Hardesty, we need you in LA. I told you that when I met you, but we need, so sometimes there's this conversation about identity that's really important and that I absolutely believe in. And much of my scholarship has been about the way in which Black women represent us in office. And when we talk about true progressivism and really willingness to engage in radical work, radical meaning getting to the root of it all, it's Black women who are at the forefront. At the same time, as we think about womanism and Black feminism and our foremother, Zora Neale Hurston, and her brilliant words that all skin folk and kinfolk We got to remember that, right?
Mhm.
So Councilwoman Hardesty represents the absolute best of what it means to lead from a Black woman-centered perspective. But we also have women, the first Latinx woman president of our city council, Nuri Martinez, who has had to be pushed around this budget process, right? We have Monica Rodriguez, who's in bed with LAPD. So just because someone is a woman and even a woman of color doesn't mean that they're going to be advocating for our interests. And so those of us who authentically represent our communities, and I mean that term, you know, as in the way Lonnie Guinier uses it, right? Who represent our community from the perspective of, we want to not just, our interests are not based on or rooted in our own aspirations, but rooted in the uplift of our community. Those of us who move from that perspective have to challenge all of those in elective office to actually represent the people. And so it's really important that we, as we think about the way in which institutional sexism and institutional racism pervades really every system in this country, that we also recognize that people who look like us don't always represent us. And it's gonna take the masses of people to move folks. It's great to have a champion. And when you don't have a champion, the people have to become our own champions.
Thank you so much. I want to, I know, Nithya, that you might have to jump off. I have one more question. So if you have to go, no problem. I will, we'll talk to you soon, and we really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, City Commissioner Hardesty, and you, Dr. Abdullah, about some of the disconnect between the polling and the budgets, right? So we, Data for Progress and the Justice Collaborative Institute have done just extensive polling and reports on voters' attitudes towards decarceration during this crisis. And voters are overwhelmingly in favor of decarceration, in favor of police not arresting people for being homeless, for not towing vehicles that homeless people reside in. Voters are overwhelmingly in favor of eviction moratoriums, on suspending rent during this crisis, on forgiving rent for this crisis. And yet, as you guys are both identifying, where mayors and city councils are still seem to kind of fear police departments, fear cutting their budgets, even in a time of crisis. Can we talk about why this is? What is it that makes it so difficult to push back against the police in a moment even like this one?
Well, the thing that the police have that houseless people and poor people don't have is a PR arm. And so every budget cycle I have watched over the last decade, how just before a budget cycle hits, the press releases that come out from policing are all about creating fear. And in a situation where you've created community fear, you can sell them a tactic that may or may not make sense if they were not in the midst of fear. So I have seen over the last decade, every budget cycle, the police yell, they don't have enough people, they're understaffed, they need more resources, and they are able to create the community push to have white middle-class homeowners who they terrify, and to calling city council to demand more resources for policing specifically. And I think what this crisis has done has really given us an opportunity to say, what is the appropriate response to community concerns? And it can't be just more police, more weapons, more weaponization and criminalization of houseless folks. So I think that is really part of the challenge, is changing the narrative about what community safety looks like. And as we've heard on this call today, communities of color don't feel safer with more police. We will feel more safer if we have housing we can afford to live in. We'll feel more safer if we get rent protection, because even as we all know with the moratorium, people are facing eviction as soon as the moratorium is up. We are anticipating a 30% unemployment rate coming out of the pandemic, which means for Black folks, that really means we're talking a 60% unemployment rate. And so this is why I'm working so hard now to change the narrative around what does community safety looks like, how do we support our most vulnerable community members, and how do we center those who we know were on the edge before the pandemic hit and will be much more exasperated. Their financial well-being will be exacerbated by the economic downturn that we're all in. And so we have to shift people from thinking that safety equates to a police officer with a weapon and talk more about community safety from a holistic approach.
Thank you. Dr. Abdullah?
Yeah, absolutely. Just echoing everything Councilwoman Hardesty has been saying. And I just want to make another pitch for Los Angeles. The weather is also much better here. So I think that as we talk about the overspending on police, what's happening is we are fed this notion that police can do everything. So when we talk about unhoused communities, what do our cities do? They spend on police. What do police have to do with housing folks? Nothing. In fact, they exacerbate the problem, right? When we talk about public health questions, what this city is doing is saying, well, we need police to be in grocery store parking lots, right, to enforce. No, we don't. A group of Black leaders came together in Los Angeles a little more than a month ago and issued a set of demands and said, we don't need police to do these things. You know what we could do? We could take that money, employ Black people, and have them give away masks and gloves as people enter grocery stores, right? Why are we not doing that? They have police at food distribution centers. They're citing, well, there's massive amounts of food there. So what? I never heard of anyone ever rolling up on a county food distribution center, and the food is not that good, right? And stealing the food, is that what you're alleging we do, right? And so what we could have, again, is community workers helping to make sure everybody stays safe through a public health pandemic with an economic fallout. Why are these elected officials so beholden to police? Why would someone like an Eric Garcetti be pushing an increase to LAPD in the midst of a public health pandemic with an economic fallout? Well, in addition to the PR units, we also have to remember that these police associations who mask themselves, who parade themselves to be unions, they are not unions, they are associations, they are fraternal orders of police, right? Police protective leagues. What they're doing is they are both threatening and funding candidates for office. If we take the district attorney of Los Angeles County, Jackie Lacey, who has signed off on 600 murders by police, refusing to prosecute officers when they kill our people, right? We need to look at who's funding her reelection campaign. Her reelection funds are almost completely by the Police Protective League and the Sheriff's Association, right? So these elected officials like Garcetti, who also takes money from these associations, feel beholden to the police associations because they fund their reelection campaigns. And so it's important that we begin to think about how are these people funded and who are they beholden to?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah. And thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. This has been an incredible conversation, and we're really just grateful for the work that is happening in Los Angeles, grateful for the work that's happening in Portland. This is obviously a moment of major change, and we're either going to, change the way that we operate and take care of vulnerable people, or we're going to return to things as normal. And like you said, Commissioner Hardesty, I think that this is an opportunity for us to not return to things as normal, to really rethink how we spend our money, what we prioritize, and how we take care of people. So thank you so much for joining the briefing. We really appreciate you taking the time out so early for joining us from the West Coast. And for everybody tuning in, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.